I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
The moment began behind a closed palace door, with King Charles seated at a polished table and a sealed folder placed before him. No announcement had been prepared. No public statement had been drafted. Yet within minutes, the room understood that something irreversible had happened. Charles had discovered that Camilla's private circle had arranged a secret deal to influence palace staffing access and protect her allies from internal review. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had entered the morning briefing expecting order. The king believed he was walking into a routine household review, the kind of quiet palace meeting where schedules, staff movements, and internal permissions were checked before the day moved forward. Buckingham Palace, the official working home of the monarch, runs on discipline because one unclear instruction can ripple through every royal office. That was why the silence felt wrong. Senior aides who usually spoke with careful confidence now sat stiffly, waiting for him to see what they already knew. Charles opened the folder slowly. The first page looked ordinary, but the meaning behind it was anything but ordinary. The file described a private arrangement that had given trusted members of Camilla's circle influence over palace staff appointments, internal access, and protected communications. A staff appointment means deciding who is allowed to serve in certain palace roles, and internal access means who can reach sensitive rooms, messages, and royal offices. This was not gossip. This was control. And the king understood at once why the matter had been brought to him with such fear. Charles kept reading, but something in him changed. The monarch was not simply studying a problem of management. He was staring at a wound inside his own marriage. Camilla was not in the room, yet her name seemed to sit between every line. The queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning king who holds royal status beside him but does not rule in his place, had allowed her private circle to move too close to the machinery of the palace. That realization cut deeper than any public scandal could have done. An aide lowered his eyes when Charles asked who had authorized it. That small movement said more than a full confession. The king looked from one face to another, waiting for someone to defend the chain of command, but no one did. Then he found the handwritten note attached to the back of the file. It suggested the deal had been kept outside normal royal channels, the official routes through which decisions reached the monarch's office. Someone had not merely forgotten to inform him. Someone had chosen not to. Charles set the folder down. No anger came at first. No raised voice. Just a silence heavy enough to make every person in the room understand that the palace had crossed into dangerous ground. Then the king gave the order in a low, controlled voice. Camilla was to be summoned privately. Not later. Not after lunch. Now. William received word before she arrived. The prince listened without interrupting, and when the message ended, he did not ask whether it was true. He asked how long it had been happening. That question revealed something colder than shock. The future king had felt the shift in the palace before anyone dared name it. But before the confrontation could begin, the palace had to face the one question no one wanted to ask aloud. Who stood to lose the most if Charles spoke the truth? Every royal crisis has a public face, but this one had several private wounds hidden beneath the surface. Charles carried the burden of authority. Camilla carried the fear of exposure. William carried the instinct to protect the future of the monarchy. And around them stood palace staff who had spent years learning when to speak, when to bow their heads, and when silence could become dangerous. Charles knew the file had changed the room before anyone admitted it. The king was not only a husband sitting with evidence of betrayal, he was the sovereign, meaning the person who carries the highest authority of the crown and whose decisions shape the royal household. That made every page heavier. If he acted too softly, the palace would believe private loyalty mattered more than official order. If he acted too harshly, the wound inside his marriage would become impossible to hide. He understood both dangers, and that was why his silence frightened the staff more than anger ever could. Camilla had spent years learning how palace life truly worked. The queen consort understood that influence did not always come from speeches or public ceremonies. It often came from who had access, who received information first, and who sat near the right door at the right moment. A royal household means the group of aides, officers, and staff who support the monarchy's daily work, and Camilla had built trust inside that world through loyalty and patience. But now that same network looked like a hidden structure standing beside the king's own command. William received the news in a side room and went still. The prince did not rush to defend anyone, and he did not speak like a son wounded by family tension. He spoke like the future king, careful and cold, because he understood what divided authority could do to the monarchy he would one day inherit. After several seconds, he asked the only question that mattered. How far did it go? The aide who delivered the message could not answer quickly, and William's face changed before the silence ended. Camilla sat alone in her private apartment before the summons arrived. She watched a staff member enter with a strained expression, and she knew at once that this was not routine. The queen consort did not ask whether Charles was angry. She asked who else had been told. That question revealed fear, not confusion. She understood that a private matter had already begun moving beyond her control, and the one person she most needed to persuade was now reading the pattern she had hoped would stay buried. Palace staff had noticed strange instructions passing through unofficial channels. One message had redirected an appointment request. Another had delayed access to a sensitive office. A third had protected a trusted name from review. None of it seemed explosive alone, but together it formed something dangerous. A senior courtier watched Charles connect those separate moments inside his mind, and the courtier felt the room tighten as the king realized the arrangement had been hiding in plain sight. Charles looked up from the file with the expression of a man who had found not one secret, but a system. The senior courtier lowered his gaze again, unable to soften what the papers now proved. William had already been informed. Camilla was walking toward the private meeting room, and one aide whispered the line that turned the whole crisis colder. The prince knows. And the deeper Charles looked, the clearer it became that this secret deal had not appeared overnight. It had been born from one earlier moment the palace had tried to bury. Long before Charles opened the file, there had been one night when the balance inside the palace quietly changed. It did not happen in Parliament, at a public ceremony, or before cameras. It happened after a private royal dinner at Clarence House, when a seating decision, a whispered complaint, and a closed-door conversation created the trigger that would later explode inside Buckingham Palace. Camilla remembered that dinner because humiliation rarely leaves cleanly. The Clarence House Restoration Dinner had been arranged as a private royal gathering meant to show unity after a difficult season, and Clarence House, one of the royal residences in London, carried deep meaning because it had long been tied to Charles's personal life before his reign fully settled into Buckingham Palace. The dinner should have been simple. It should have been polished, but one seating change placed a trusted member of Camilla's household far from the center of the evening, and the queen consort saw it as more than a table adjustment. Charles noticed the shift before dessert had been served. The king watched Camilla speak softly to one of her aides, then saw that aide withdraw with a tight face and lowered eyes. A guest list role, the job of helping decide who attends royal events and where they are placed, may sound small to outsiders, but inside palace life it is power. It controls access. It shapes favor. It tells everyone who is rising and who is being pushed aside. Camilla understood that, and so did Charles. Camilla felt the decision like a warning. She believed one of her preferred aides had been moved away from a sensitive position because Charles's direct office wanted to reduce her circle's reach. The queen consort did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. But after the dinner ended, she spoke behind a closed door with two people who had served her for years, and a documented account later placed that conversation at the heart of everything that followed. Those words mattered because they turned wounded pride into organized resistance. Charles left the dinner tired and withdrawn. The king told his private secretary that palace order had to come before personal loyalty, and the private secretary understood the meaning at once. A staffing review, meaning an internal check of who holds which palace role and why, was already moving through the household. Charles wanted clean lines of authority. He wanted decisions to pass through proper channels. He wanted no private circle, not even Camilla's, to sit between the monarch and the machinery of the crown. Camilla heard about that remark before midnight. The queen consort saw it as proof that her influence was being quietly narrowed. That same night, two members of her circle spoke about protecting trusted channels before the review could advance. The phrase sounded harmless, almost loyal, but behind it sat the beginning of the secret deal. Certain staff approvals, access notes, and internal messages would be routed through Camilla's allies before they reached the king's office. Charles would later find the paper trail and understand the full weight of that night. The dinner had not been a small embarrassment. It had been the moment fear became strategy, and strategy became betrayal. Once Charles understood where the arrangement began, he knew the next step could not be handled through aides, memos, or palace procedure. He had to face Camilla himself. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with quiet. Camilla entered the room expecting a controlled conversation, but Charles had already placed the folder in the center of the table. No advisors sat between them. No private secretary softened the language. The king looked at her not as a distant monarch, but as a wounded husband who had finally found proof of betrayal. Charles asked for the room to be cleared before she could speak. The king did not look toward the aides as they left, because his eyes stayed fixed on Camilla. A private secretary, the senior aide who manages sensitive royal papers and protects the monarch's official schedule, paused at the door for 1 second, then obeyed. That pause mattered. It showed everyone outside the room that this was no longer a household issue. It had become personal, dangerous, and impossible to contain. Camilla reached for the arm of a chair before sitting. The queen consort kept her face controlled, but her hand betrayed her. Charles saw it. He had seen that same composure in public for years. The steady smile, the calm voice, the ability to move through pressure without giving the world anything. But this was not the world. This was the king sitting across from her, with a file that proved her private circle had touched the palace's inner machinery. Charles pushed the folder forward, but he did not open it at first. The monarch let it sit between them like a verdict waiting to be read. A secret deal, in plain words, meant a private arrangement made outside the proper command chain, where staff approvals, access notes, and protected messages moved through Camilla's allies before they reached his own office. That mattered because a palace cannot survive two hidden systems. One system serves the crown, the other serves fear. Camilla told him the arrangement had been meant to preserve stability. She said trusted people had been protecting the household from confusion, not creating it. The queen consort spoke carefully, but Charles heard the weakness beneath the explanation. He opened the file, turned one page, and read a single line from a recorded internal note. Final review to be held until clearance from her side. The king looked up then, and the words landed harder than anger. His office had been bypassed. Charles told her the damage was not simply that she protected allies. The king said the real wound was that palace staff had begun to believe there were two centers of authority. Camilla looked away for the first time. She understood what that meant. In a monarchy, authority is not only power, it is trust made visible. Once staff doubt where command begins and ends, loyalty turns into calculation. Then Charles revealed the second blow. One staff appointment connected to the deal had delayed information reaching William's office. The prince had not been directly attacked, but he had been touched by the arrangement. The future king had been pulled into a private struggle he had never agreed to enter. Camilla tried to answer, but the king raised his hand slightly, not to silence her cruelly, but to stop the damage from spreading further. Charles closed the folder. The confrontation had begun as a wound between husband and wife, but it could no longer stay there. He told Camilla the matter now had to move beyond private hurt, because the structure of palace control itself had been compromised. What began as a private confrontation now became a question of power, and the palace had to decide who truly held the authority to command its own walls. Power inside a palace is rarely announced with a raised voice. It appears in small movements. A key returned, a name removed from a list, a door that no longer opens. After confronting Camilla, Charles moved with cold precision. The emotional wound remained, but the king understood something larger. If palace authority had been split in secret, it had to be restored in public silence. Charles did not leave the room as a husband seeking comfort. The king left as a monarch forced to repair damage before it spread any further. He ordered an immediate review of staff access, appointment approvals, private communication routes, and household permissions connected to Camilla's circle. Staff access meant who could enter certain rooms, receive certain messages, and approach sensitive royal offices. Appointment approval meant who had the power to recommend or place people into trusted palace roles. Those details mattered because the crown depends on a clean chain of command, and the secret deal had blurred that line. William entered the controlled briefing with a careful face. The prince was not brought in to punish Camilla, and Charles made that clear before anyone spoke too freely. He was there because the continuity of the monarchy, meaning the smooth transfer of royal stability from one reign to the next, had been touched by the arrangement. The future king understood the danger at once. A private wound could be forgiven inside a family, but an institutional weakness could damage the reign after Charles, and that was a burden William could not ignore. Charles sat with the first restriction order in front of him. A senior courtier watched the king pick up the pen, pause, and lower his eyes for a moment longer than usual. A restriction order, in simple terms, was a formal palace instruction limiting who could access certain information or roles. The courtier understood the pause. Charles was not signing against an enemy. He was signing against the influence of his own wife's circle, and the cost of that truth showed in his stillness. William chose his words with care. The prince told his father that personal pain could not be allowed to become institutional weakness. Charles looked at him then, not with anger, but with a tired recognition. The king knew William was right. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but this was different because it reached into the quiet machinery that kept royal life moving. If staff began asking whose approval mattered more, the palace would no longer be serving the crown. It would be serving competing loyalties. The review exposed the depth of the confusion. Some staff believed Camilla's approval carried the same practical weight as the king's office. Others had waited for clearance from her side before passing messages forward. That discovery cut through the room. Camilla had not issued a public challenge, but her private network had created one in practice. Charles understood the danger immediately. Authority does not need to be stolen loudly to be weakened. Sometimes it is weakened by delay, by silence, by one unofficial instruction repeated too often. Charles removed Camilla's informal influence over staffing access connected to sensitive royal communications. The king did it quietly, without a public scene, because public drama would only make the palace look more divided. But inside the walls, the meaning was unmistakable. Names changed, permissions changed. Certain doors became harder to open. Certain calls no longer moved through familiar hands. Camilla's circle felt the shift before anyone explained it. One staff member close to the queen consort received the news before sunset. He was stopped in a corridor, handed a brief note, and told his access had been revised. His face fell where others could see it. No one spoke. No one needed to. The palace no longer felt like a home under strain. It felt like a court watching power change hands. The palace did not need a public announcement for the shock to spread. Staff knew by the way doors closed. They knew by the sudden movement of private secretaries. They knew when one aide emerged from a meeting pale and silent. By evening, Camilla's carefully built circle understood the truth. Charles had not merely discovered the secret deal. He had begun dismantling it piece by piece. Names began disappearing from lists before anyone outside the palace knew anything had changed. Staff access lists, meaning the records that decide which aides can enter certain rooms, receive sensitive messages, or work near protected royal offices, were updated in silence. Several people linked to Camilla's informal network were removed from sensitive internal circulation. That mattered because circulation is power. When a person stops receiving certain notes, they stop shaping certain decisions. When a door no longer opens, influence has already begun to die. Charles kept the palace moving as if nothing had broken. The king allowed appointments to continue, phones to ring, cars to arrive, and public duties to remain untouched, because panic would only make the rupture look larger. But behind that smooth surface, every department understood the truth. The monarch's office was taking back direct control. Palace operations, the daily system that keeps royal work running, had to look calm because the crown survives on order. Yet the silence behind that order felt sharper than any public statement. Camilla received the first written restriction notice in her sitting room. The queen consort read it once, then read it again, as if the words might soften the second time. They did not. Her name was not attacked. Her title was not questioned, but her reach had been cut. She folded the notice slowly and did not call for anyone. That quiet reaction carried more pain than shouting, because she understood exactly what had been taken from her. A loyal aide stood outside her door, frozen between duty and fear. He had served Camilla long enough to know when she wanted support, and when support would feel like pity. His hand hovered near the door, then dropped. The aide did not enter. He knew the humiliation inside that room belonged to the queen consort alone, and he also knew that everyone in the corridor already sensed it. A second internal note made the new reality impossible to mistake. Any future household appointment connected to protected royal access had to pass through Charles's office alone. Protected royal access meant contact with rooms, messages, and schedules close to the senior family. That line mattered because it removed the gray area where Camilla's circle had once operated. There would be no side approval, no trusted channel, no quiet delay. William's staff received their own confirmation soon after. The prince's office was told that earlier communication delays would be reviewed, and that detail changed the temperature of the crisis. The future king had not simply been watching from the edge. His household may have been affected by the deal, and Charles knew that made the matter impossible to leave half-finished. Then the mood shifted. Just when Camilla appeared most isolated, Charles requested one final private meeting. The king did not send the message in anger. He sent it with restraint. And that restraint frightened the palace more than fury. The palace expected another confrontation, but what came next was quieter, more painful, and far more revealing than anyone anticipated. The turning point came not in a council room, not before senior courtiers, and not under the weight of royal procedure. It came in a private sitting room, after the palace had gone still. Charles and Camilla faced each other without aides, titles, or prepared lines. For the first time since the exposure, the issue was not power. It was trust, and whether anything human remained beneath the damage. Charles asked for the meeting after the restrictions had already begun. The king did not offer it as a negotiation, and Camilla understood that before she entered. The orders were signed. The access lists had changed. The private channels had been closed. Royal procedure, meaning the formal way palace decisions are approved and carried out, had already moved beyond emotion. That mattered because this conversation could not save the influence she had lost. It could only decide what remained between them after the crown had acted. Camilla arrived without her usual shield. The queen consort did not carry the same sharp control she had shown during the confrontation. She looked tired in a way that made the room feel smaller. Charles noticed it, but he did not soften the truth. He told her he could forgive ambition more easily than secrecy. Ambition, he said, could be understood. It could even be managed. But secrecy made him question the quiet moments that had come before, and that was the wound no restriction order could repair. Camilla listened, and for once, she did not answer quickly. The queen consort admitted through a recorded private conversation, later described in palace notes, that she had feared being pushed aside. She had watched a younger royal structure forming around William and Catherine, and she believed the future was moving without her. The prince and the princess were not simply younger figures in the family. They represented continuity, the idea that the monarchy keeps its strength by preparing the next generation before the current one is gone. Camilla saw that shift and held power too tightly. Charles heard the admission, but it did not free her from consequence. The king revealed that he had not acted because William pressured him. He had acted because the file proved palace authority had been privately redirected. That distinction mattered. If the prince had forced the move, Camilla could have called it rivalry. If Charles had acted from anger, she could have called it pain. But the evidence had left him no escape. The crown had been touched, and the monarch had answered. Camilla realized the most painful truth in that silence. The secret deal had not failed because it was discovered. It failed because it confirmed the mistrust she feared already existed. She had tried to protect her place, but the effort made that place weaker. She had tried to hold influence close, but the hidden grip exposed how fragile it had become. Charles stood before the conversation could turn softer than the truth. The king left the folder untouched on a side table, as if even looking at it again would give the wound new life. Camilla remained seated after he walked out, and the quiet around her felt final. By morning, the palace would prepare a controlled public response. What had been hidden behind velvet doors was about to meet the force of public judgment, and the monarchy had to decide how much truth the nation would be allowed to see. By sunrise, the story had escaped the palace's careful grip. The world did not see the private file, the closed door, or Camilla's folded notice. But it saw enough. A monarchy built on control suddenly looked exposed. The public did not need every detail to understand the emotional shape of the crisis. Charles had drawn a line, Camilla had crossed it, and the palace staff had watched history shift. Charles allowed the palace statement to go out before the morning cycle hardened around rumor. The king knew that silence could protect dignity for a few hours, but it could not protect authority forever. The statement confirmed a household governance review and revised internal access procedures. Household governance, in plain words, means the rules that decide how royal staff, permissions, and internal decisions are managed. Revised access procedures meant certain people would no longer reach sensitive offices, messages, or staff routes in the same way. The language sounded calm. The meaning was not. Camilla's name did not appear in the statement. The The queen consort was not accused in public, and Charles did not turn the matter into open punishment. But the timing spoke louder than any direct line could have done. Everyone inside the palace understood the statement was tied to the secret deal he had exposed. Everyone outside sensed the same thing. A carefully written notice had become a royal warning. The king's office was correcting a breach without letting the whole world see the wound. William arrived at Kensington Palace with a fixed expression. The prince did not stop when questions followed him from the gates, and he did not offer even one soft phrase to calm the crowd. Kensington Palace, a royal residence closely linked with the next generation of the family, mattered here because it represented the future Charles was trying to protect. William's silence carried weight, because the future king was no longer distant from the crisis. His household had been touched. His patience had limits. His face told the public enough. Camilla's absence became the image no palace aide could soften. The queen consort missed a scheduled appearance, and the empty space beside the event program seemed louder than any denial. She had spent years building a place beside Charles, yet now the strongest sign of her situation was not what she said. It was where she was not. That absence made the crisis feel real to people who had never read a palace document in their lives. The public moment arrived with brutal clarity. The front page of the London Herald showed Buckingham Palace behind dark iron gates with the headline, "The King Takes Back Control." A front page matters because it turns palace whispers into a national story, and that image gave the country a simple verdict before the palace could shape a softer one. By mid-morning, a broadcaster described the crisis as the most personal authority test of Charles's reign, a phrase that changed a staff review into a national drama. Crowds gathered near the Victoria Memorial, the public monument outside Buckingham Palace where people often gather during royal moments. Some came in curiosity, some came in judgment, some simply wanted to witness the crack in the polished surface. Charles had chosen the crown over comfort, and the nation understood it. And once the public understood that choice, the final meaning of the scandal became impossible for the palace to soften or reverse. In the end, the scandal was not simply about a secret deal. It was about what happens when private fear reaches into public duty. Charles exposed more than an arrangement. He exposed the dangerous cost of divided loyalty inside a monarchy that survives only when authority is clear. For Camilla, it was a humiliation. For William, it was a warning. For Charles, it was a final test. Charles brought the matter to its final page with a hand that did not shake. The king signed the final review order, and the palace entered a stricter internal structure where staffing access and sensitive communications returned firmly to his direct authority. A final review order, in simple words, means the last written decision after an internal investigation, setting out what must change and who must follow it. This mattered because the monarchy could not afford confusion inside its own walls. If staff did not know where authority lived, the crown itself would begin to look uncertain. Camilla understood the meaning before anyone explained it to her. The queen consort had not lost her title, and she had not been removed from public life, but something quieter had been taken. Her private channels no longer carried the same weight. Her trusted circle no longer stood between palace decisions and the king's office. The palace presented the resolution as order restored, yet everyone inside knew something personal had been permanently altered. A marriage could continue in public, but trust had changed shape behind closed doors. Charles stood alone at his desk after the last signature dried. The monarch was not triumphant. He looked older, as if victory had taken something from him instead of giving him strength. That was the cruel truth of the moment. He had protected the institution, but he had wounded the private world around him to do it. The crown, meaning the authority and duty carried by the monarch, had demanded discipline. The man beneath it had paid the price. Camilla sat in silence after the last aide left her room. The queen consort understood that influence gained through private channels had cost her public trust. She had tried to protect her place, but the very effort had exposed how fragile that place had become. The secret deal ended not with a dramatic confession, but with consequence. Doors changed. Permissions changed. People changed how they spoke around her. William saw the lesson clearly. The prince recognized what this meant for the next reign. Secrecy may protect people for a short time, but it weakens the institution forever. The future king understood that Charles had not exposed Camilla to destroy her. He had done it to prove that no personal bond, no private fear, and no hidden circle could outrank the crown. This moment meant the monarchy had chosen survival through discipline over comfort through silence. Charles' decision wounded the palace, but it restored the line of command. Camilla lost the hidden leverage she had built, and the royal household learned a lesson it could not forget. Loyalty without transparency is not loyalty at all. The crown remained standing, colder than before, but unmistakably in control. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.